like a spark of joy about it. That's how I felt reading your book, so thank you for that. It's a great book. I want to get to lots of stories about it, but before we do that, I want to just ask you a little bit about how you became a writer, your journey to this. Your early childhood was in Malaysia. Then when you were 13, your family moved to the UK. Mm-hmm. Back when you were a kid, what did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
Ooh, this is a great question. So it depends how young we're talking, because if you mean like when I was a kid, like 4, 5, the answer was zookeeper, which is clearly not where I've ended up. I loved animals for as long as I can remember loving pretty much anything. My mum recently discovered a book that I had when I was 8, and it was my favorite book, and it was a college-level animal encyclopedia that I in no way understood, but that had very beautiful images of the entire animal kingdom throughout, and it captivated me and fascinated me. And precocious little brat that I was, I also annotated various parts of the book, made little notes, little informational notes, and wrote a foreword to it.
Do you remember any of those annotations or any good lines from the foreword?
Right. So, okay. The foreword says things like, this book contains all the animals in the world. You can take this book with you to zoos, plural, and it will tell you all the animals that you will see. Happy reading.
Perfect in every way.
Who was I writing that to? I wasn't lending this book out. Was it like to like 40-year-old me? Maybe.
Did you ever take the book to the zoo?
Yes,
yeah.
I did.
So how did you become a writer? How did that happen?
Through a very sideways route. So like many people who graduated from college with a science degree, I thought I was going to be a scientist, and I started in a PhD program in a lab that focused on molecular biology, and very quickly realized that I was catastrophically bad at it. And I think many people, most graduate students, think that they are the worst graduate students in the world. I objectively was. Or at the very least in the top 10 worst. I was a danger to myself and my lab mates, and I hated every goddamn second of it. So while I was trying to work out what to do instead, I think I realized that I was much better at writing and talking about science than I was at actually doing it. And so did this very circuitous path that involved starting my own blog, trying to build up a very small freelance career, then a medium-sized freelance career, and then a full-time, larger freelance career for the publications that you've heard about already. And that led to being a staff writer at The Atlantic and writing 2 books.
Wow. Let's talk about, you've already explained that you had an interest in animals from a very early age. When did you sort of refine that into, I'm going to write a whole book specifically about their senses?
Okay, I can tell you exactly when that happened. It was, I think, December of 2018, when I was sitting in a cafe in London with my wife, Liz, and I was going through this gratingly self-flagellating period of thinking that my career had peaked, that I have no good ideas anymore, that I didn't know what I was going to write a second book about. And Liz, as is her way, listened very patiently and then fixed all of the problems by saying, why don't you write a book about how animals sense the world? This type of stuff happens a lot to us. Yes, so she has also, she was a marine biologist. She now works in science storytelling, and she has been interested in this intersection between animals and aesthetics for the longest time. So her graduate work, which she also didn't finish, was on the way fish that live in coral reefs sense color. So we've been thinking about these issues. We talk about this at home. Like we're both fascinated by it. And the minute she suggested it as an idea, I realized that it was the perfect topic for a book for a lot of different reasons. The science is fascinating, right? Like I could write something where every page had something that would a little factoid that would blow people's minds. But it was also philosophically fascinating. This idea of thinking about the conscious experience of another individual, or in this case, another species, is something that people have been thinking about for the longest time. It's a very difficult task. It's a very rewarding task if you attempt it. And that the topic was inherently beautiful. So when I write nonfiction, I'm not trying. I try and do much more than just do a dry explainer of what is going on. I try and make the writing lyrical and captivating and poetic. And this topic lends itself to that very, very easily. So it contained everything that I look for in the subject of a book. I knew that I was going to have a lot of fun delving into this for the next 2 years.
I think we anthropomorphize animals a lot and try to, oh, look, my dog is smiling, or that animal at the zoo is happy to see me or angry or something. And to some degree, I guess you can perceive an animal's intention. But you use this beautiful word in the book. It's a new word I learned from the book, umwelt, which is German. And correct me if I'm wrong, it is basically the idea of an animal's sphere of perception.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what exactly that concept is and why it's so important to everything that follows in the book?
Yeah, so umwelt is just German for environment, but in this specific context and the way it was used by scientists, it means much more than just the physical environment. So my umwelt is not the chair I'm sitting on, it's not the table over here, it's not the mic I'm holding in my hand. My umwelt is my sensory environment. It's the part of reality that I can perceive. And inherent in the idea is that there is a part of reality that I cannot perceive. Right? So there are sights and sounds and smells and textures that my body gives me access to. And a lot of those things that I cannot detect, as well as things like the magnetic field of the Earth or the electric fields given off by living things. But other creatures can. They have their own extraordinary sensory worlds that are different to mine, limited also in their own way. If we were joined on this stage by a dog, an elephant, a snake, a bat, a bee, they would all be in the same physical space, but they will all have a radically different experience of that world. And that is what the umwelt concept is. I think of it as one of the most beautiful and profound in all of biology because of two reasons. First, it's very humbling. It tells us that despite the feeling that we're all sitting here, that despite this very powerful illusion that we are perceiving all there is to perceive, that is in fact an illusion, that we are only privy to a thin sliver of the fullness of reality. But I think that the second reason it's profound, I think, is that it's incredibly expansive, right? For that exact same reason, it tells us that even in the most familiar of surroundings, there are new things to discover. There are wonders to behold. There are flickers of the magical in the mundane and the unfamiliar in the familiar. And that is a large chunk of why I wanted to write this book, not only because it reframes our understanding of animals as being more fascinating than we thought, but because it changes our experience of the world around us. Because knowing about what animals can sense changes how we think about what a flower is, or what a garden, what kind of information is present in the gardens or the streets or the bay around us, right? All of these things in our world that we know very well, we realize actually we don't know them very well. And that aspect of defamiliarization is something that I'm looking for in my writing.
So you mentioned if these particular animals were on stage with us. Can you pick a couple of them and give us an example of how they might differently perceive what's around? The elephant and the snake, or any two that you want to pick.
Sure. So this is the introductory exercise to the book, and I chose that because this whole area demands of you effortful feats of imagination, and so that's where we start. So if you had an elephant on the stage, it would be able to smell things that we cannot. Same if there was a dog sniffing around, say my dog, he's a corgi, he would be exploring the stage, picking up little trails of scent. He would know which people he was familiar with had been here before. Even if I walked on the stage, he would smell my lingering scent in this chair. The elephant would also be able to hear low frequencies that we can't hear, and would be able to communicate with other elephants in the same way. If there was a bat on the stage, it would do the opposite. It would be producing very high frequency calls that we can't hear. And by timing how those calls, when those calls bounce back from the objects around it, it would be able to build up a map of this room, of you all, and navigate through that room. Even if we turned off all the lights, even if it was pitch black, it would still be able to fly around. If there was a rattlesnake in the room, firstly, why? But how did that happen? But if we turned off the lights, the snake would also be very aware of our presence, because rattlesnakes and a few other kinds have pits on the front of their snouts that allow them to detect the body heat of their warm-blooded prey. They can sense the infrared radiation given off by that prey and effectively see in heat. If there was a songbird, pick any songbird. I saw a blue jay earlier. Imagine if there was a blue jay sitting on the stage with us. The jay, like all other birds, has access to an entire dimension of colors that we can't see. So this already very colorful rug or these flowers would look completely different to it than to us, kaleidoscopic. It would also be able to sense ultraviolet, which is a color at the far end of the rainbow that we can't detect. But a lot of these flowers would probably look very different to it, because flowers have ultraviolet markings that are meant to attract pollinating insects that can also see ultraviolet. Humans are kind of weird in not being able to detect this color. Something like a sunflower, what color is a sunflower? It's just yellow. Actually, it's not. A sunflower is yellow and ultraviolet. It has a vivid ultraviolet bullseye in the middle to draw the attention of insects. The jay will be able to see that. Songbirds would also probably be able to detect the magnetic field of the Earth itself. This is now fall, it's migration time, so a lot of songbirds are coming into this area. You'll probably see, those of you who bird new species that you've never seen before, those migrations over continental distances are guided in part by this magnetic sense, this ability to use an internal compass to find their way, even when other landmarks are invisible. So I could go on, right? But the point is that there's so much that we're missing, and there's basically as many different ways of experiencing the world as there are species in it.
You mentioned that obviously there are visual things humans can't perceive, but you also say in the book that, and it surprised me, that humans have some of the best, and best might be too broad a word, but some of the best vision among the animal kingdom. So yes, in some ways, in acuity in particular. Now, you're wearing glasses, I have like -7.5 and -6 contact lenses in, so we are not the best examples of humanity's visual superiority. But in general, yes, humans have the sharpest vision in the animal kingdom, except for birds of prey, so hawks, eagles, and the like. We outclass almost all other animals in terms of acuity, and that means that our experience of nature is actually very different to what other animals will see. So butterflies often have very intricate patternings on their wings, spots and stripes. The butterflies cannot see those patterns. A bird might be able to, we certainly can. To them, it's all just going to be a smudge. Zebras famously have black and white stripes, but to all of the predators that hunt zebras, like say lions, hyenas, those are just going to blur into each other at most distances. So to a lion, a zebra mostly looks like a donkey most of the time.
which is one reason why those stripes are definitely not for camouflage, as they are often said to be.
Do we know what the stripes are for? I mean, it's not the supermarket lane, so like what is it that
Right.
Yeah.
The best idea, and I think a really convincing idea, is that the stripes are anti-fly adaptations. So for some reason, horseflies get befuddled by zebra stripes. If they try and land on a zebra, they just flub the landing. They miss. People have done amazing experiments to show this, including like putting a black and white zebra coat on a horse, or like painting like large horse-like structures in zebra stripes. And they're very effective fly deterrents. So why aren't all horses black and white? It's because zebras, A, have a much thinner coat than other horses, and also live in Africa, where there is a much larger number of flies that spread diseases that are fatal to horses. So for all of those reasons, you have this one weird horse in this one part of the world that has just gone in this very random direction because they're fly-proof.
That's amazing. Before we go any further, I want to keep talking about animal vision for a second, but
Oh, can I make a point about the vision question you
Please.
asked earlier? So Ed asked whether humans have excellent vision, right? And this is a really important point, because while we have excellently sharp vision, our vision is terrible at night, right? It's why we struggle to see in the dark, and it's why the dark looks black and white to us. That is not the case for a lot of other creatures. So in the book, I write about this bee that lives in Central America, and it lives inside a stick which it has hollowed out, and it emerges in the dead of night, in night so black that you would not be able to see your hand in front of your face. And it flies around foraging for food, and then it comes back and finds the exact same stick and the exact same hole in the dead of night through vision. Now, I don't know if you've been to a rainforest, but there are a lot of sticks. And somehow the bee can sense. Now, it has its vision is much less sharp than ours, and there's a reason for that. You can only have either very sharp vision or vision that's really good at night, and you cannot have both. If your eye has tons and tons of light-sensitive cells inside it, like think a lot of pixels on a screen, then it has very high-resolution vision. But now each of those receptors is just picking up a tiny fraction of the total amount of light coming into your eye. So you're now divvying up the total amount of light coming in by a lot of different sensors. So you've got a great high-resolution display, but it really, really sucks when the light coming in gets low. And that's why you can either have high acuity or high sensitivity. And this is a really important point, because no animal is great at everything. So even just in vision, we have I've given you an example where your excellence in one domain costs you in another. And the same applies across the senses. So nothing is great at everything, nothing senses everything, and indeed nothing has to. And that's why, partly why, the umwelt concept even exists. We are all limited in our own ways.
So it was amazing to me to think about how different animals see the way they need to see.
Right.
And two examples in the book that I'd like you to talk about. You mentioned vultures, and why vultures and other birds sometimes collide with these enormous wind turbines that should be just clear as day to anything in its path. And also you mentioned cows, which is fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, let's do vultures first.
Yeah.
So I just told you that the only animals that have better, sharper eyesight than humans do, not us, but the average human, are birds of prey, right? So hawks, eagles, and vultures among them. So vultures have incredible eyesight. They can spot carcasses while soaring up on high. So how is it possible that a vulture could crash into an object as blatantly conspicuous as a wind turbine? And the answer is that a vulture's to get the answer, you have to think about a vulture's field of view. So that's where it can see. So my field of view is everything around me in this kind of circle, right? So I stop seeing about here, about here, about here. Now, a vulture's field of view extends all the way to the sides, so it can spot other vultures soaring, so it knows where its pals are looking for carcasses. It's very good straight down, but it has a blind spot above its head that'll be lower than mine. So my vision cuts off here, its will probably cut off around here or so. And what that means is when it's soaring and looking down, it can't see what's in front of its own head. And why would it have ever needed to? In the entire evolutionary history of a vulture, there was never a case where there would be a giant object right in front of its head while it was soaring in the middle of the sky. So, right, like, on the one hand, it seems completely absurd that this very sharp-eyed animal would crash into a wind turbine. But you only think that if you aren't considering its sensory world and what it can actually perceive. And with the cows, right? So,
well, real quick on the vulture. That's interesting. Is that also why we have bird strikes on airplanes, or is that just speed?
Probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
Probably a bit of both, because bird strikes and airplanes come from a large number of different species.
Yeah.
So cows,
yes.
Right? Cows, so your eyes have an area of best focus right in the middle, right? So your vision is sharpest in the center of your field of view. But a lot of animals have focal areas that are very differently shaped. So for a cow, it's horizontal. A cow's best field of, the area of best vision is a streak running across the horizon. It's very good for plant-eating prey animals because they can scan large strips of land for predators. But because of that, and because a cow has eyes more on the side of its head, it has more wraparound vision than ours, similar to a vulture, I guess. And that means that a cow is aware of what is going on around it without having to do that. A cow that's grazing can sense someone approaching it from the side, a little bit from the back, certainly from the front. And that partly gives it that very somnolent air that we think of as being dumb, right? Because we are animals with two forward-facing eyes, and we have come, and our biology forces us to explore our surroundings like this. So we have come to equate an active gaze with an active intelligence. But if you don't need to do this to look around, then you don't. And so many animals that don't do this seem dumb to us, and that's unjustified. On the flip side, animals that do look around a lot immediately seem like spookily intelligent. So in the book, I write about jumping spiders, which are tiny little things that will fit under my fingernail. They have incredibly sharp eyes. Like a jumping spider can see the moon, even despite being a few millimeters across. And they absolutely will turn around, so turn and look at you. So if you wiggle your finger behind a jumping spider, it will turn and it will gaze at you in this very eerily, like primate-like way.
So cows can't see above. So if you want to sneak up on a cow, you like a parachute.
A vulture, you just grab a vulture.
You grab a vulture, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
What about animals that see in different directions? Chameleons that have what seem like two differently moving cameras on their face. How do they perceive that?
Yeah, very good question, and I don't know. And actually, let me give you the best example of this that I know of. So there is an animal called the mantis shrimp, which is not a mantis and not a shrimp, but it's a relative of shrimps and crabs, and it is notable for two things. One, for having the fastest punch in the animal kingdom. It has these two little claws folded up praying mantis style under its head, and it strikes out with them to kill crab, to break into shells. It's an incredibly beautiful, very, very violent creature. It also has the weirdest eyes in the animal kingdom. It has two eyes that look a little bit like soufflés, and they're on stalks, so they can move in opposite directions. Each eye has three separate areas that can focus on a point. So we have binocular vision, where we have two eyes that give us that we focus on different points in the world around us. Mantis shrimp has trinocular vision on each of its eyes. It also we have three kinds of color sensing cells in our eyes, and that gives us all the colors that we know from red to violet across the rainbow. Mantis shrimps have somewhere between 12 and 16. And you might think then that they live in this incredible kaleidoscopic world of trillions of colors that we can't imagine, and in fact they do not. If you put mantis shrimps to a test, they actually have much poorer color discrimination than basically anything that's been tested, including ourselves. So things that will look like orange or yellow to us look the same to a mantis shrimp. So what does it need those 12 to 16 color sensing cells for? One idea is that it's about speed. So our eyes, those three kinds of cells, there is a ton of fancy neural pathways that go from those to our brain. And that subtracts and adds the signals from those cells in complicated ways that give us all the colors we can sense, right? There's a ton of processing there. The idea with the mantis shrimp is that it doesn't do any of that. It just has 12, it basically divides the visual world up to kind of like, think of like a children's coloring book, where the whole thing is divided into spaces that are numbered, and each of them is a different color. And all of that information is sped to the brain without any processing at all, which allows it to be very fast, which is why it has one of the fastest punches in nature. So the mantis shrimp thinks like, oh, cells 1, 5, 6, and 8 have gone off. That is blue. That's a mate. I'm going to try and punch it. Or like numbers 2, 3, 12, and 10 have gone off. That is food, so I'm going to punch it. And no animal has an eye that works like that. The closest we have to something that sees in that way is a satellite.
Wow. Let's talk about smell. And I want to start with dogs.
Yes.
And before I ask the specific question, you have one of the best named dogs a writer could possibly have. For those who don't know.
His name is Typo.
And do you spell it correctly, or is that part of the...
No, we do spell it correctly. It would be too confusing otherwise. I mean, you know, he's a corgi. He is small, difficult to catch, often embarrassing. When he's bad, he's typography. Typography!
That's the
you come here right now!
That's great. Dogs' nostrils have a very specific shape, and there's a very specific reason for that.
Yes. Okay, so imagine if a dog is sniffing along a surface, right? It's doing this. Every time it exhales, you might imagine that it would blow away all of the lovely scented molecules that are abundant on that surface. So it would sniff in, get information from the world, but then it would exhale and then blow all that stuff away and then have to repeat the process. But those of you who have dogs may have noticed that the nostrils aren't just like ours. They have two side slits. The nostrils curve around the side in an apostrophe-like shape. Those slits are really important because when the dog exhales, they create swirling vortices of air that actually sweep up scented molecules into the nose. So a dog, regardless of whether it is inhaling or exhaling, is constantly getting this conveyor of smell into its nose. And it's one of many different hardware adaptations that explain why their sense of smell is so good and also why it's so important to them. You know, my sense of smell is very flickering. It's stroboscopic. If you've ever tried to smell like along a surface the way a dog does, and I have actually done this because because of journalistic integrity. It's really hard. Like, you lose the trail because every time you exhale, you void all of the scent from your nose, you blow away what's on the ground. Not so for a dog. I think that a dog's sense of smell is continuous, much like my visual understanding of the world is like is a continuous movie rather than a set of individual frames.
Elephants. The most famous nose in the animal kingdom, perhaps. If you grow up watching cartoons, you think those are for spraying water. But in fact, they are highly sensitive, really incredible sensory organs.
Incredibly sensitive. You know, elephants, like dogs can do incredible things with their noses, right? Dogs have been trained to sniff out electronics and drugs and rare animals. Elephants could do all that too. Elephants can detect things that, like TNT, that is odorless to humans. But the most important thing that elephants do with their sense of smell is to smell each other. They live in a world where smell is incredibly social, and it is tied to their incredible intelligence. And there's a great experiment that I wrote about in the book that highlights this. So a woman named Lucy Bates was studying elephants in Kenya. She would follow a herd, wait for them to pass by, and wait for one elephant to pee. And then she would go up to, wait for the herd to leave, and then collect some of that pee-soaked soil in a Tupperware. And then she would drive around until she found either the same herd or a different herd, and then put the soil in front of those elephants, and then drive off and see what happens. And what happens is this. If it is a completely different herd of elephants, they will find the soil, sniff it, and not care, and go on their way. If it is the same group of elephants, the one who knows the individual who left that smell, they will be curious. They will explore. But if it is the same group of elephants and they know that the individual who left that pee is behind them, they will get super confused. Because their sense of smell allows them to not only know who else is in their herd, but also where they are. It gives them a spatial awareness of their herd as they move through the plains. And if they very well know that one of their pals is behind them, then how did that elephant teleport ahead and leave a bunch of pee on the ground? Makes no sense. It's very confused. And I think that gives you a sense of like, how important smell is to elephants, but also, you know, how much of a part of their intelligence, how much a part of their social lives it is, in a way that it really isn't for us.
And every time I hear stories like that about scientists and the things they have to do to learn their way in science, I think, you know, go into science, it's super glamorous, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Right. Get a Nobel Prize, or maybe drive around the savannah with a Tupperware full of piss-soaked soil, trying to find a herd of elephants in time. I mean, you know, there's either way's good. You do you.
Lastly, on smell, I think snakes are really interesting, and I think we have to talk about them smelling. I hope I'm not oversimplifying this. Smelling with their tongues.
Yep, no, that's exactly it. Everyone thinks that tongues are organs of taste, and for us, they certainly are. For snakes, tongues are organs of smell. And why is the tongue forked? It's because the snake can smell in stereo. So let's say you're a snake tracking a mouse. The snake crawls along, it flicks its tongue out on the ground. The two tips capture molecules of smell that the mouse may or may not have left behind and then draw in. The The snake can then compare the amount of chemicals on both prongs of the fork. And so if there's more on the right than the left, it knows that the mouse went that way and heads in that direction. If both have the same amount, it goes straight ahead. If the left is more than the right, it curves left. It's a stereo smell detector. But snakes don't just flick the ground, they also flick the air. And that is basically like a sniff. It is the same as my dog raising his head and going. When a snake sticks its tongue out, it also flicks. It does this up and down very, very quickly. That conjures up two rotating vortices of air, kind of like two big donuts on either side of the snake, that suck air in from either direction, concentrating the faint traces of chemicals that are just wafting in the air onto the tips of the tongue, which it then analyzes when it draws the tongue in. So it's an incredible smell sensor. It just looks like a tongue.
Did writing this, you've been curious about animals for a long time, but did writing this and getting this deep into the subject sort of resituate the way you saw animals and the way you thought about animals?
Yeah, very much. I wanted this book to spark curiosity and empathy for the natural world. I wanted people to spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about what their dogs are experiencing, or even what the spider building a cobweb in the corner of their rooms are experiencing. I think there are important practical ways this matters. So for dogs, a lot of dog owners will yank their dogs along on a walk, and the assumption that a walk is for exercise or for travel. But what do dogs love to do on walks? They love to smell, because smell is their primary sense. It's their main way of exploring their world, and they need time to smell. So I take my dog on sniff walks, where he gets to set the pace, he gets to determine where we go, how fast we go, and he will often just spend like half an hour just sniffing his way around one block in our neighborhood. To pull him away from that, and sometimes we need to do that, but to do that all the time is a little bit like going for a hike and having your friend cover your eyes at every viewpoint and pull you along. It's not very fun, and dogs certainly become more optimistic, happier, less anxious if they are allowed to sniff to their heart's content. So I think knowing about this certainly helped me make my dog's life better. It gives me a greater appreciation of the animals around me, even ones that I already liked and respected, like elephants. I think the most important part of the book, though, is that it does change the way you understand the world around you. And I can give you a few examples. So in the green spaces around us, so parks, gardens, whatever, there are lots of little insects called tree hoppers and leaf hoppers. And you may not have heard of them, you may not have seen them, but I guarantee you, if you've been anywhere green, you will have sat next to a leaf hopper or a tree hopper before. These insects vibrate their abdomens to send vibrations along the stems and leaves of the plants on which they sit that other leaf hoppers and tree hoppers can pick up on. These signals are not sounds as we traditionally know them. You could put your ear right up next to one of these insects and not hear a thing. But you can convert these vibrations into audible sounds with nothing more complicated than a clip-on microphone and an amplifier. And if you do that, what you hear are sounds completely unlike what you might think an insect would make. Not the simple chirp of a cricket, but something melodic, haunting, eerie, something that might sound more like birds or monkey hooting or musical instruments or even machinery. And the idea that all of the plants around us, the parks, the gardens, are full of these vibrational choruses that we have no access to is just magical to me. It just hints at so much unfamiliarity in places that we take for granted. And the same could be said about the flowers around us, right? I already said that flowers have signals and symbols in ultraviolet that we can't see. Now, if you take all the flowers in the world and you ask, what kind of eye is best at seeing all the colors present on these blooms? What you get is something very much like a bee eye. It is an eye with, like ours, has 3 kinds of color sensing cells, but that are most sensitive to blue, green, and ultraviolet. It's a bee eye. And that eye is really, really good at telling the difference between the colors on all the flowers that exist. So you might think then that bees have evolved eyes that are really good at looking at flowers. A totally reasonable hypothesis that is completely wrong. The truth is that bees and their ancestors came first. Their eyes were already around before flowers evolved on the scene. And so flowers evolved colors that ideally tickle the eyes of bees. And that's magical to me because it contradicts this intuitive idea that the senses are just passive things, that I'm sitting here intaking light and sound and all the rest without having to do very much. In fact, the senses, simply by perceiving the world, change it. They alter it. They paint it. The eyes of bees, simply by existing, led to the colors of the flowers that we see. And so beauty is not just in the eye of the beholder, it arises because of that eye. And that, I think, is wonderful and profound and changes the way I think about a meadow.
Yeah. So you mentioned the dog walk. This book has changed some of your own perceptions of things. Has it changed your behavior? The dog walk might be an example of that, but has it changed the way you move through the world?
Yeah, it has. I started birding about 4 months ago when I moved from DC to California. And part of that was just trying to be more aware of my surroundings, trying to bring all of my senses to bear. In the book, I write about the problem of sensory pollution. This is the last chapter. This is about how we fill the darkness with light and the quiet with noise. And we do so to the detriment of the animals around us. Light pollution distracts baby sea turtles from the ocean and pollinating insects from the plants they're meant to service. Noise pollution pushes away animals from places that they might otherwise thrive in. These forms of pollution don't seem like pollutants to us. They're not like plastic on a beach or chemicals from a smokestack, right? But they are pollution nonetheless. And to me, they are the pollution of disconnection. They not only harm the animals around us, but they sever our connection from nature. They make nature harder to appreciate. In noisy environments, it's really hard to understand how much life is around us. I tried doing a little birding earlier, and there's like a big main road nearby. There's a main road running from here to like my hotel. It's so loud. There are planes flying overhead. I couldn't hear a thing. And that makes it feel like nature isn't there. There's a reason why in the early pandemic, a lot of people suddenly went, "Are you hearing a lot of birds?" And there was this whole meme, nature is healing. It was this idea that like humans were inside, so birds were like, we're taking back the neighborhood. And in fact, that wasn't the case. The birds were always there. It's just that the normal din of human activity means that we don't hear them. Noise pollution not only makes it harder for us to hear what's there, but also contracts the area over which we can hear things by a significant degree. So our bubble, our sensory bubble, shrinks. And I think that's a problem, because if you go through your life like that, then nature and wilderness feel like very distant things. They feel like things that aren't part of your daily lived experience, and there's less impetus to savor it and protect it. Part of the reason I started birding when I moved to California is that birdsong is omnipresent in my neighborhood. It's quieter. I can hear so much. I can now identify a dozen or a few dozen species by ear. I can see and hear, like I had this beautiful moment where I walked out of my door last week, a little bit earlier than I normally would do with my dog, and just stopped on my doorstep and thought, I wonder who's around. And I could identify like 5 different species of birds just by like the little flickers of sound that I could hear. And it made me feel so much more connected to my neighborhood and to the world around me. And I think we lose a lot of that when we lose a lot of that because of of all the stimuli and all the information, all the signals that we have put out into the world. So yeah, to answer the question, thinking about the book and thinking about my senses, about the problem of sensory pollution, really opened up this new way of experiencing nature that, as someone who has been fascinated by animals since I was a kid, wasn't really tapping into.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that. As I was listening to you, I was sort of flooded with this memory of when I lived in Alaska, and I lived not far from the water, and coming home late at night after covering a city government meeting and being grumpy because the meeting went to 11 over a debate about, I don't know, the softball field or something. But I was unlocking my door, and I could hear a humpback whale blow. I could hear that out in the water, and I just sort of stood on my porch and like lost track of time for a minute. And I wonder, it makes me think about what we can do in a place like Traverse City is, here in the core of town is busy. We're not that far from quiet places and dark places. And I wonder what we can do as individuals to start feeling some of those connections and start getting more in touch with the things that are right here.
Yeah, so for birding, one thing I found that's incredibly helpful is an app called Merlin, which is produced by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it runs on my phone. And I have it running when I'm walking around or even when I'm just working in my office, and it identifies birdsong. So it picks up birdsong around, and it automatically classifies them in real time. And that's incredible, because you can walk around and go, oh, I'm hearing a bush tit or an oak titmouse or a robin. And you can slowly learn birdsong. So if you hear something unusual, you can look at Merlin and go, oh, that was Anna's hummingbird, and now I know what that sounds like, and I can slowly triangulate on that in my head the more I hear it. That's been really wonderful for that sort of birding by ear experience. I've really enjoyed that. But I think also just going out to trying to have those experiences. Before we had the tech check for this event tonight, I had 10 minutes to kill, and I went for a walk, and I saw a green heron fishing on the stream that runs just north of here, a species that I'd never seen before, but that just happened to be flying past me because I stopped at the bridge and looked around. And I think just trying to do that and taking those little moments, is a great thing. I heard a red-shouldered hawk on the same walk, and if you cross that bridge where the stream is and look at the far bank of it, about 2 trees along, there's a giant nest up in the tree where I think the hawks are. So yeah, there's so much to find, and I think a lot of it requires just that patience to step out of our normal routines and to try and engage with the information that's out there.
You and I are wearing masks because there's been a new wave of COVID infections going around. I know a lot of my friends have said, oh, it's my turn, and the picture of the test on social media and everything. You became well known for your reporting during the pandemic, and for its candor and its depth, and helping people fully understand what was going on, especially at a time when there was just so much information floating around. Some of it misinformation, some of it just our wild reaching for whatever we could get about this new thing. In September, you wrote on the platform formerly known as Twitter, about stepping away from the Atlantic for 6 months because it had become a lot, all of that. And I want to read the quote. These past 3 years have been the most professionally meaningful of my life, but they've also deeply broken me. The pandemic isn't over, but after a long time spent staring into the sun, I need to blink. I did not spend as much time as you did thinking about COVID, but boy, did that hit home with me. I felt it. I think a lot of us really felt worn down by all of it. Have you found a way to, I don't know, process it, to think about it, have it in your life in a non-intrusive, less intrusive way?
Yeah. So the pandemic was hard for a lot of people. The specific ways it was hard for me in my work were varied and intense. So the stakes were very high. Trying to make sense of what was happening in real time in a way to help people, it was very challenging, especially when I was trying to make sense of it for myself. The amount of information was vast. Trying to sift through all of it in real time was incredibly difficult, and actually, I think only got more difficult over time. I've said that with every passing year, the number of people who once made sense about the pandemic and are now full of shit grows, but the number of people who were full of shit and now make sense is zero. So the pool of sources that I can rely on dwindles by the month. And I tried very hard to give voice to communities that were badly hit by the pandemic and continue to be in a cumulative way, including healthcare workers, people who suffer from long COVID, immunocompromised people, people who lost loved ones to COVID. Doing that work, bearing witness to suffering, is draining to a level that I had never experienced before, and I'm still not really quite, haven't quite processed. There would be entire weeks where I would spend every working hour listening to dozens of people telling me about the worst days of their lives. And healthcare workers will often talk about how they would see the absolute worst of COVID during their day and then drive home past people who, they would drive home, pick up their groceries from a supermarket where no one was masking, drive past bars and restaurants that were full. And that disconnect between what they knew was actually going on and the sort of reality we'd been pushed to accept was really hard, and it was hard for me. It continues to be hard, and for all of these reasons, covering this was immensely emotionally challenging. In talking to all of those communities I mentioned, I've really only found 3 broad solutions that they have used to cope with it. One is to double down on a sense of duty and mission. And it's got through a lot of healthcare workers through their worst days. A lot of people suffering from long COVID found advocacy to be a restorative thing for them. It gives them a sense of drive when their worlds have been so badly contracted. The next is to find community, so to share your struggles with others who are going through the same thing. Again, all of those groups have found their own networks that have helped to bolster each other, even in the face of great societal dismissal. And then the third is just to stop. Which is what I did in September. At some point, I realized that I couldn't deal with it anymore, and you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on the person next to you. Right? So you cannot report on things this grievous and difficult if you yourself are a wreck. So I stepped away and try to get better.
Before we go to audience questions, which I'm excited to hear, let me just put a hopeful note on this and say that it seems like after this book, your previous, and the joy you bring to sharing what you see and perceive with all of us, expanding our umwelts a little bit, I guess. What's next? What happens now?
So, right, and let me sort of bridge from the down note that I ended on with that last question. On the one hand, it seems like covering COVID and writing about animal sensors these are two separate things that have nothing in common with each other. And I've come to realize that that's actually not true. Because most of my work, regardless of the topic, has been about trying to find some hidden aspect to the world around us that powerfully influences our lives and that is worth knowing about. Sometimes in a joyful way, like with the senses of animals, but most of my pandemic coverage was either saying, here are the deep vulnerabilities in our society that allowed a novel pathogen to kick our asses. Or here are entire groups of people who are still suffering from this pandemic that we've been told is over, and whose knives and needs we need to recognize and think about. It's always about the hidden the hidden stuff that we need to know. And the exploration of that is grounded in principles of curiosity and of empathy. So I want people to put themselves in the shoes of a dog or an elephant and think about how they sense the world. I also want people to put themselves in the shoes of someone who lost their dad to COVID, or who is immunocompromised and still can't exist in the normal world that we have so rushed to get back to, or who has long COVID and is still sick 3 years on from getting infected. I want people to think about lives that are very different from their own, and I think that we could all use a bit more of that. So this is a very roundabout way of answering the what's next question. I actually sent out a proposal for book 3 to my publishers last week. And while I'm not going to say exactly what it's about, I don't want to jinx it, it does continue those themes. You know, it's all part of this. It's all the same values that animate my work. And I see book 3 as kind of concluding a trilogy that began with I Contain Multitudes and continued with An Immense World.
Well, Ed, thanks for this conversation. It's not over yet, of course. We have a lot of wonderful folks here who I bet have a lot of wonderful questions. We've got an audience listening virtually as well, and we hope they will send in questions too. If you want to ask a question, we've got, on the lower level here, we've got 2 microphones in the aisles, and we can just have you line up at those, and we're going to kind of rotate around. We also upstairs have a floating microphone. We get a hand wave where that is, maybe. There it is. Okay, so raise your hand if you're up there and you want to ask a question. We'd love to come to you. And so we'll start. Let's see here. We'll start right here. And one more note, too. Let's try to keep our questions a little concise just because we want to get as many in as possible. Go ahead.
Firstly, this is very much a treat for me, as I'm sure it is for many others here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next, when I first became aware of you, it occurred to me, I realized that you very much go to first sources, the research and the data. And from doing that, I'm wondering if you would share with us 1 even, or 2, of the most elaborate, ingenious experiments. And you did mention some or allude to some, but some of the standout ones from which we can infer authoritatively what you've done.
It's a great question. One thing I'm really fond of involves scallops. So scallops are kind of fancy clams. And while many of you have probably eaten scallops, most of you probably didn't know that they have eyes. So scallops have rows of eyes along the flanks of their shells, up to 200 in some species. They can look incredibly beautiful, like little neon blueberries. So what do scallops need eyes for? What do scallops see? And Dan Spicer, who's a scientist who I talked to, did this incredible experiment that he called Scallop TV, where he put scallops in front of screens and showed them little movies of little particles, showing like resembling flecks of food drifting past. And when they saw that, they would open their shells and extend their little sensory tentacles and explore further. So Scallop TV. They described this to me as like the most absurd experiment that they absolutely did not think would work, and yet somehow did.
I think it's funnier because the shells look like little couches. Like they would have to. That's amazing.
That's right. Yeah.
Do we have a question upstairs? So let's see. Right here?
Thank you. To follow up a little bit, as I was reading, about halfway through the book, I kept on going back to the notes, the bibliography, and all I could think of is a line from Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. Who are those guys? And it's like a cast of thousands, and who supports them? It's sort of a two-part question. Did you have much of an opportunity to talk with many of them?
You mean the scientists?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I must have interviewed more than 100 different researchers for the course of the book, many of whom I met in person and went on like fun adventures to their labs and field trips. Yeah, people who study sensory biology are a wonderful cast of people because their work is almost entirely curiosity-led. You know, there are ways of justifying these projects in quite utilitarian terms, and modern academia pushes people in that direction. So, you know, you try and say that there are going to be incredible technological or health applications from doing this kind of work. But ultimately, it's just about trying to work out what the hell is going on with this weird animal and what you know, how it's experiencing the world. I think that it's a wonderful way of doing science, and one that that we should embrace more of. I said at the start of the book that in a men's world, you know, you could study animals, animal senses to either get a better understanding of how our own biology works as proxies for us, or for technological applications. And there certainly have been those. There are hearing aids based on fly ears and telescopes based on lobster eyes. But I don't care about any of those things. I really, this is a book about animals for their own sake. And I think that's a view that a lot of the researchers that I talk to share. Thanks.
We have an off-duty journalist here.
You outed
This
me.
is one of my colleagues. Hi, Ellie.
Thanks for being here tonight, both of you.
Thank you.
I'm very excited to read this book immediately. I have been reading a lot about jellyfish lately for work, and it's got me thinking a lot about radially symmetrical animals, and animals who don't share eyes and noses and the digits that we use to make our way through the world. And I was wondering what you've found about how radially symmetrical animals sense the world around them.
Yeah, great question. So some jellyfish actually do have eyes. Box jellyfish have 4 sets of eye clusters around the pulsating bell. And they're really weird. Each one of these clusters has, so eyes can range in complexity from really simple pits that are just about detecting light to one similar to what we have that have a whole high resolution image. And these jellyfish on each of their clusters have at least 2, I think 4 different types of eyes of varying complexity. So what are they all for? We do not know. But certainly these animals can see, and they can use their eyes to navigate their surroundings. They live in mangrove waters, so there's this sort of complicated network of routes to move around. By looking up at the sky, they can tell when they are in shade, which is where the fish that they hunt are more likely to be. And this is all incredible to me because these animals have no brains. Right? So they have a nervous system, but it's very disparate, and there's no centralized thing that's what we would call a brain. And yet, they have reasonably sophisticated eyes and can use it to do pretty cool things. Thanks.
We'll come over here in just a second, but we have a virtual audience member with a question, I
Yes,
think.
this is a question actually in regards to, can you comment on animals coming into town from the forest during COVID-19? And then this person is from Traverse City, and he watched a bobcat at his bank in downtown, and then later had a bear in his tree just this past Mother's Day.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things going on here. There were a lot of claims of this nature, and to be clear, I don't want to dispute this, but I'm saying this to note that this nature is healing thing, this animals coming into human space. There were a lot of like weird ones that were debunked, like dolphins in some like I think canals in Venice, but there were definitely cases of people spotting more animals in urban spaces. Partly that's just if there aren't people around, animals will explore more. And partly it's that people were bored and noticed a lot more animals in spaces that they wouldn't have noticed animals in, right? So partly it's the lack of noise pollution, so I'm hearing more birds. I'm also, staring out my window in despair, and I'm seeing more birds. And then it's also that there aren't many people around, so they're not producing noise, so now that habitat becomes more conducive for birds. So there was a great experiment that spoke to some of this. It's the Phantom Road experiment, where researchers recorded the noise of a highway and then played it out of speakers in this very remote, hilly part of Idaho. So just the noise of cars, absent the threat of the actual vehicles or the exhaust or anything like that, was enough to reduce the bird population by 1/3 of its species and to reduce the body weight of a lot of those that left behind. So noise is a big deal. It really impoverishes the community of animals that live near us. So without it, they're more likely to come into human spaces. And again, without us there, without the threat of us, without the sensory cues of our presence, a lot more animals venture into spaces that they would otherwise have stayed clear from.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Ed, for this book. This is incredible. I hope people will start taking their dogs on smell walks. It's a great idea. So my question is about the umwelt, and just kind of wondering if you've expanded your meditations on the umwelt to other categories of life, like plants, microbes, quasi-life like viruses, possible life like artificial intelligence, anything along those lines. Pick one, I guess.
Oh, this is a great question. So even things like viruses, which it's debatable whether they're alive or not, do sense stuff. So viruses can detect chemicals that bacteria produce, and those that infect bacteria use can rely on that. So bacteria trade chemicals that help them coordinate their activities in large numbers. So that itself is sensing. That's a little bit like smell. Viruses can eavesdrop on those. So those that infect bacteria can use those signals to work out when there's a large enough concentration of hosts to. So that's a case of a possibly inanimate thing or something on the cusp of animacy having a sense. There is a lot of really interesting work on plants and their sensing. There is a paper that I wrote about, I think in 2018 or 2019, about how some flowers essentially function like ears. They provide plants with the ability to hear, to tap into the sounds produced by animals. But I can't say too much about this because I haven't written about it in depth. A friend of mine named Zoe Schlanger is publishing a book, I think, next year about the intelligence of plants. And I would highly recommend looking out for that when it comes. Thanks.
I'm going to cast my gaze upward here. Any hands in the balcony? If not, we'll come back down to this mic here. Okay. Yes, please.
This is a little different kind of question. My younger science students got totally hooked on reading I Contain Multitudes by watching the Tangled Bank production with you in it, and of course they became your biggest fans. And it really inspired them to read the book. And so my question is, will there be a similar production with your latest book?
Hopefully. So there are 2 projects that I'm working on. I'm really trying to get a documentary version of An Immense World Off the Ground, but these things are difficult to do. We want to do something bigger than the YouTube series where I Contain Multitudes. We want it to be like a big Planet Earth style thing. But that's challenging. And I do have a production company that I'm working with. We are hopefully going to pitch studios and broadcasters soon. So fingers crossed. I'm being relatively chill about it because I know a lot of these projects just go nowhere, so we'll see what happens. The one that actually is going to be a thing, and that I know this because it's midway through production, is a middle school adaptation of An Immense World. So there is a young reader's version that is currently in the works, and that will be out hopefully in a year or so.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
I think we're going to have time for 2 more questions. Is that about right? Yeah, 2 or 3 more questions. So let's. Do we have anybody up there? I'm trying to rotate around here a little bit. I see a hand right there. Yep. So let's go up there.
And then let's let these 2 because they...
Oh, yeah, okay.
So obviously you've done quite a lot of research about all these different animals. Were there any stories or animals that you learned about that didn't make it into the book and you wish did?
I love this question, and I can never remember the good ones that aren't in the book. I sort of feel like, right, so every animal that is in the book is there not just because it does something cool, but because what it does changes our understanding of either the sense that it uses or some aspect of the world around us. So in the chapter on smell, it's not just about something has a great sense of smell, but like with the elephants, it's about showing that smell can be used to ground a social life. Or with dogs, it's about showing how our most familiar animal has abilities we don't understand, or that it's perceiving things on a walk that we don't perceive, so changing our understanding of the sidewalks around us. I picked all of the examples in the book to have that kind of multi-purpose utility, and so there weren't a lot of things that that fit that bill that didn't make it. And a lot of the ones that are sort of in the footnotes. So if you do have a physical copy of the book, I highly recommend reading the footnotes. There's a bunch of cool stuff in there. One of my favorites that's a footnote thing is about a snake called the puff adder, which is found in Africa, and seems to have some kind of smell camouflage. So dogs will walk over a puff adder and be unable to detect it in a way that just wouldn't work for, like, dogs have an incredible sense of smell. Most snakes would be very obvious to it, but somehow the puff adder it isn't there. It's like smell invisible. The same applies to things like meerkats, which also have a really good sense of smell. How that works, no one knows yet.
Before we're going to wrap up with you two folks since you've been queued up for so long, but I just want to say, you even write footnotes well. Like, they're entertaining.
Thank you.
There was one that was like, I asked this question, then I asked this question, then I questioned why I was doing this whole book, and then I went back to work, and then I decided to keep writing the book. And I was just like,
Right, but like it's part of the bargain with the reader, right? Like everything has to be worth reading,
Yes.
even the footnotes, maybe even especially the footnotes, because if they're not worth reading, why are they there?
That's right. All right, last two questions here, please.
Hello. Hi. I'm here because I went to another National Writer Series of an author that I really admired, and I asked her to pick 3 separate genres of books and tell me your favorite of each genre. And for nonfiction, she said you, and that's why I'm here. So I'd like to ask you the same question, pick 3 separate genres and tell me some of your favorite books.
Ooh. Man, usually when people ask me this question, I immediately forget every book I've ever read. Books, I don't know them.
It was your idea, by the way, to go over here for the next question. Just saying.
It was. I did this to
great.
myself. Thank you for stalling for a little while. Okay. Nature writing. Let's pick the most obvious genre. I loved a book called How Far the Light Reaches by a friend of mine named Sabrina Imbler. I could theoretically put forward this book for 2 separate categories because it is a blend of marine biology and memoir. It is about, it's 10 different essays, each of which reflects some aspect of Sabrina's life and some incredible species that lives in the ocean, using both as metaphor for each other. And it just works beautifully. And Sabrina, I think, is a generational talent who will be one of the most acclaimed science nature writers of their generation. Let's pick something completely different. So I think just in the literary fiction genre, I loved Trust by Hernan Diaz. You probably have heard it. So it was on the Times Top 10 Books of the Year list last year. It won the Pulitzer. Hernan doesn't need me to be his publicist, but it is a book containing 4 different stories that are all tied to each other and that all complicate the truth of what the previous stories had had portrayed. It is fundamentally a book about money and about capitalism and about the bizarre dual nature of money, in that it is both a very tangible society-shaping force and this completely absurd abstract concept. Science fiction / satire. I read a book called Chain Gang All Stars by an. I'm not going to say a name that I don't know how to pronounce. So Chain Gang All Stars by an incredible young black writer. It is kind of a satire about the U.S. carceral state taken to its logical extreme, which is televised gladiatorial death matches. It is considering what it is about and the dystopic nature of the setting. It's a surprisingly tender book and like this very moving queer love story. And I think it's about finding love and hope in the worst possible circumstances. And also is a devastating send-up of the US carceral state. So these are all 3 books that have really stuck with me.
Thank you.
Great question. All right, last question tonight. Hi.
No pressure. My name's Sonia, and I actually came with my sister and parents. We're all very happy that you came to Traverse City. But my question is, when I was 10, I actually found a preserved extinct elk skeleton in the bottom of a lake near my home. And throughout that research project and process and my citizen science work, I've found that when you ask a question and get an answer, that often opens a door to many, many, many more questions. And I wanted to see in your process with your work and your curiosity how you choose which doors to open and go through and which doors you leave shut for the time being.
Oh, damn, these are great questions. Wow. So, right, I love this question because it speaks to the generative nature of both science and writing. With science, it is absolutely true that every answer simply leads to more questions. There's a bit in the book that I love about where I talk about how turtles can navigate with the Earth's magnetic field, and the scientist who showed all this started working at a time when we already knew that things like songbirds had this magnetic sense, and he thought, his advisor said, go study turtles, they probably have a magnetic sense, and he was like, this is going to be so simple. I'm just going to duplicate these experiments with the turtles. They probably have a magnetic sense. He was like, my main concern was I had a 2-year project and I didn't know what I was going to do for the second year. And that was 30 years ago. And he's still studying turtles, which still kind of make no sense to him. So there's that. And journalism is very similar, right? Like if I do my job well, every one of these, each door I open should lead to more doors. It's very challenging when you're writing a book because at some point I need to stop the research and actually write a book. And I often look for the times when I feel that my knowledge is hitting an asymptote. So it's where it's leveling off, where I'm talking to someone new or reading a new paper or looking at a new thing, and I'm starting to hear a lot of the things that I've heard before. And that's a sign to me that I've done sufficient research to really grapple with the fundamentals of what I'm writing about. And I am also looking for things that are foundational, rather than just details that are like icing on the cake. So with the senses, for each sense, I'm really thinking hard about what the strengths and weaknesses are of that sense, how animals use it, what it is really like to inhabit a world of echolocation or magnetoreception. And you can find examples that illustrate those principles, but it's those sort of underlying principles that I'm really thinking of. The same with I contain multitudes, right? So instead of just making the thing a collection of cool stories, like what I've shown tonight, I'm trying to get at something deeper, some sort of fundamental, foundational understanding of the way the world works. And I think that helps the book be more timeless, even though science itself changes all the time. But it also tells me when I'm ready, like when I'm done, and when even though I've opened 100 doors, I can still see like the shape of this maze that I'm stuck in, and I know how to get my way out of it. If that makes sense. Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. So. I have one more thing I want to share with you, so stay put for just a second. But before we get to that, Ed Yong, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Ed Yong. So here's what we're going to do. We want a picture of all of you fabulous people. If you have books, we're going to ask you to hold them up. Ed's going to stand right here, and Ed's going to be in the foreground. We're going to take a picture out this way of all your smiling faces. Can we do that now? Yeah. All right. Do we have a book handy that Ed can hold up? Hey, Noel, can we borrow that book? Oh, here, we got one. There we go.
Thank you. Where do you want me?
You're all stunning, by the way. Great. Nice work.
You are all stunning. Thank you. And as a final gift, Cherry Republic wants to send Ed on his way with these wonderful chocolate cherry treats that I'm giving him on his way out. Thank you all for coming. So appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Up next is American Gun, written by 2 Wall Street Journal reporters. The event is Tuesday, September 19th. The book takes you behind the scenes to understand the creation of the AR-15 assault rifle. The authors write about why it's such an effective weapon in combat and how it became the main gun of choice for mass shooters. We hope you'll join us. Get tickets at nationalwriterseries.org. Good night.